Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Hi, everybody. This is Bob Bazanko, co-host of the Green and Red podcast, Scott's on Assignment. And I am here today again with one of my dear friends and one of an awesome guest in the past as well. And that's Fadi Kafeety. And we're going to talk about what Fadi is doing in a minute. But I just want to introduce him to the Green and Red podcast. And Fadi, you recently took a new position, and we can see that behind you on the tapestry. You want to talk a little bit about the Jerusalem Fund?
Yeah, sure. So thank you again, Bob, for having me as a dear friend of the podcast. It's always an honor to be right here before you speaking today. I wish we had the chance to meet with Scott as well, but hopefully the next time. So I took over about a month ago, I took over at the Jerusalem Fund, where I currently serve as the executive director for the center over there. And we're an independent registered 501c3 working in Washington, D.C., that aims to foster greater awareness about Palestine, and both in the United States and abroad, and to ameliorate the lives of Palestinians, both living in Palestine and in the diaspora. Our fund, the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development, is comprised of three main programs. We have our educational arm, which is the Palestine Center. Historically, it was the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine back in the day, but it became the Palestine Center. So that aspect hosts educational events, workshops, functions to raise awareness and consciousness on Palestine in the United States, and all our events are live streamed online to our audiences. We have our humanitarian link, which comprises the bulk of our operations, which is to fundraise for immediate relief efforts to Palestine. Of course, we take care of many projects in Palestine and the Arab world, but given the genocide over the past 15 months, our attention has naturally had to redirect to the majority of the work going towards Gaza, but we do provide grants for organizations and groups working in Palestine and the neighboring countries that have refugee camps. And of course, our third branch is the Al Quds Gallery. Al Quds means Jerusalem in Arabic. Al Quds Gallery, which is the cultural aspect of our operation, we have an art gallery. We do cultural events. We have open houses and the like. They've been a little bit. We haven't had any since COVID started, but we'll be resuming them very shortly. So we actually have our first cultural gallery and exhibit popping up sometime in April, and then we have another gallery coming up in August or September. So we're looking forward. There are lots going on over here, but obviously the majority of our work is towards providing direct and immediate assistance towards the people in Gaza now who are suffering under the genocide, which of course we'll get into in much deeper context now. But while the fighting is temporarily stopped, the genocide is still ongoing.
You really stepped into it in the middle of a earthquake.
I mean, there's no better time than to fight a fire than at its greatest, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, what can we do? We've been experiencing this as Palestinians for 77 years. I mean, but of course, what the past 15 months have been unscaled and unprecedented. But
Yeah,
nonetheless, I mean, it's not like conditions were rosy prior
yeah.
to October 7th.
Well, we last spoke on October 7th, 2024. We talked on the anniversary of the beginning of Israel's war crimes and atrocities against the Palestinians, and since then, I mean, we've seen movement for sure. I mean, yeah, we've seen improvement, right? Obviously, but things are different. So why don't we start? Because there's so much and it's changing literally daily. So let's just start with, kind of, I guess, the ceasefire, which has been not quite a month yet. I mean, how genuine do you think that is? Do you think that's changed the equation? Where are the people from Gaza going to go? How do they return to homes that are rubble? So you can just talk about that. Whatever you think is like the most important part of that maybe we're not really talking about.
Yeah, sure, Bob. I think first and foremost, let's start off with the fact that this ceasefire agreement came 15 months too late. And it was clear from the onset, from the very first day, that there was one party involved that was hell-bent on prolonging the devastation and destruction of Gaza indefinitely. Of course, we discussed a lot about this in our last meeting, but when we spoke, you and I, the last time, I didn't raise a point, which was that on October 8th, one day after the operation that took place by Hamas, they issued a statement to the negotiators, to Israel directly, that they were willing to release all the captives they'd taken, lay down their arms, and promise not to attack Israel on the condition that they do not enter Gaza and destroy it. Now, of course, since their stated aim was to return their so-called hostages right away, that it was clear from the onset that they did not care so much about returning their captives. In fact, as we've seen, and as Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister of Israel, said in an interview a couple of days ago, that they're open and admit the Hannibal directive they committed, which was to kill their own people because they would rather not have them as bargaining chips to negotiate with. The political cost for them is much lower to kill their own people than to negotiate with the people they colonize, right? So we say that they hate us more than they love their own people, which is why they decided to enter into Gaza,
What was
kill.
Golda Meir's famous line that we hate you because you're making us kill your children or something?
Yeah, exactly. We hate you
Yeah,
because you're making us kill your children. So
yeah,
of course they always reflect it on as if they're being benevolent about their
yeah,
killings, right? That it's our
yeah,
problem that we're being
yeah.
killed by
It's
them.
causing it's a Israeli trauma, right?
Yeah. So back to the point that we were discussing, the ceasefire negotiations had been ongoing for 15 months. They really had been, Bob. Of course, as we know, there was a temporary pause during Thanksgiving week in 2023. It was just to release some captives for some exchange of Palestinian hostages, but of course, the genocidal onslaught continued straight after that. And there were repeated attempts by the international community, despite the ICC's rulings that there might be plausible genocide happening, despite the arrest warrants for Netanyahu. They went unabashed and accelerated their program. Of course, the mediators in Qatar and Egypt and the United States had been pressing. Of course, as we discussed last time, Israel committed one of the most grave political acts of terrorism, which is to kill negotiators. They went and assassinated the chief negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, at a third party country inside Iran. So this constitutes a war crime of itself. So if they were really intent and keen on ceasefire, they wouldn't have been killing the chief negotiator. And, politically speaking, Ismail Haniyeh is on the moderate line of Hamas's military and political structures. So it was clear that they had no intent on actually bringing a ceasefire through. But alas, fast forward to 15th of January, 14th of January, the United States had announced through Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy for now President Donald Trump, that they had reached an agreement. Apparently, he had forced his way into the negotiations and made it clear that this stalling isn't going to end. Of course, there are many facets and factors to this, but Netanyahu is a very opportunistic political figure. He does not take anything without receiving in return in that regard. So he knew he was facing with a lame duck in former President Joseph Biden and former Vice President Kamala Harris. He was clear from the onset that he was also dealing under the table and openly with Donald Trump, as he was a presidential nominee prior to his election as president. So it had been quite visible that he had been waiting to see what would be most favorable outcome for his own colonial project before deciding where to take this. But alas, as Witkoff and the negotiators had managed to reach an agreement, we learned almost immediately from the from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar, who actually gave a very, very candid interview and notified us that the ceasefire agreement terms were the exact same ones. We'll discuss this now. They're the exact same ones that were put on the table in May 2024. And frankly, they were but minute details just about positioning of where the Israeli army were to withdraw from December 2023. So, and we know because the Palestinian forces repeatedly put out statements that they have agreed to X terms. They are open open to wise suggestions. They are coming to the table and saying, we're ready. Israel always backtracks at the last moment and says, no, 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 it's actually Hamas are trying to break this deal and sabotage it. So this is the cycle we found ourselves in for a long time, Bob. The ceasefire deal kind of transpired into the peace deal that we see through the Oslo Accords, right? That the peace, it's just some indefinite cycle of we're going to inch toward peace, but through destruction, war, colonization, devastation, and of course now we see the open expropriation of, or the intent of expropriation of the people of Gaza. So when the ceasefire deal was announced on the 14th or 15th, I can't remember off the top of my head, it would kick in by Sunday, January 19th, right? The bombs were dropping up until the very last moment. They were killing people in humanitarian safe zones, so-called as they put them, in hospitals, on the streets. Even as the ceasefire was supposed to kick in at 8 in the morning, there were quote unquote setbacks as people were anxiously waiting and celebrating to have the slightest bit of respite, that the drones over your head would stop, that a 2,000-pound bomb 300 feet away might not collapse your own tent and dwelling, that you might not be burnt alive in your sleep, or watch people get shredded to smithereens as they're lining up for food. It's these simple things, Bob. But even till then, there was quote unquote technicalities, and around 50, 60 people were murdered in the cold daylight, in broad daylight, just as they were celebrating their ceasefire coming through. And the last few days were very ugly, 115 to 120 plus a day. But the terms of the ceasefire, Bob, were as follows. So we had the first action, which was an initial halt of Israeli bombardment, right? Which also include Hamas laying down to their arms. The withdrawal that Israel set forth was in stages, and of course, this is what has a lot of hold up now. So we have three stages of the ceasefire deal. The first one, of course, that our arms are laid down on both sides. Although one party has only been holding up to this agreement up until yesterday. Even the Palestinian had been killed in Gaza City, and another in Rafah. A child was sniped in the border of Rafah, like one day after the ceasefire took effect. A child riding a donkey, Bob. This is the threat that they so-called see for the native population. So in the first stage, we see a phased out captives exchange, right? Of course, in the popular media, they frame it as a Israeli hostage for Palestinian prisoner deal. But of course, the Palestinians are just as much held hostage as they claim that the Israelis are in this context, because the Palestinians being released are ones held under indefinite administrative detention, under solitary confinement, without charges. Some are, of course, there are, but the vast majority, and the scale is magnanimous in comparison. There are around 10,000 Palestinian hostages inside Israeli prisons. The youngest children as well. I mean, there'd been a captive exchange deal today, but the one that happened last Saturday, 11-year-old was released. And for what? For what purpose? These are little kids, Bob, who have been traumatized and have been destroyed, who know nothing but death and destruction their whole life, and to be put inside a torture chamber, incarcerated at 11 years old, it's just unthinkable, honestly. So the terms were as follows: that the first, that Israeli soldiers who had been taken captive would be released, followed by families, followed by those who are sick, and lastly, Israeli men soldiers would be the last in this deal. And they've been rationing them at a ratio of anywhere between one Israeli captive to 30 Palestinian captives, to 1 to 61. So today, 3 men were released in exchange for 183 Palestinians. So a ratio of 1 to 61 in this context. But the terms have always been played in Israel's hand. So, of course, the first stage would have been for them to retreat closer to the Israeli settlements, to the east of the Gaza Strip. Mind you, the Gaza Strip is very, very thin for people in Houston who might be listening. It's just really the width of the two loops of Houston. So it's like moving from occupying the whole of the two loops to just the southern half of the loop. I mean, the agreements in the 2024 ceasefire were whether they would be 1,000 meters close to Gaza. Now it's 700 meters inside Gaza. So this is the semantics and pedantics that they were holding hostage 2 million people's lives to, Bob. So it also entailed the opening of Rafah crossing to allow immediate and urgent aid and relief to enter into Palestine, into Gaza in Palestine. And then, of course, the allowance of the permittance of Palestinians to return to their homes in the north, those who had been displaced under the pretext of ethnically cleansing the north. Now, they had failed significantly in ethnically cleansing the north, and we can discuss this in more detail. I'm happy to do so if we want to analyze it. But Israel set up an arbitrary line, if you will, Bob, two-thirds into the length of Gaza, whereby the north had been separated by a corridor they had called the Netzarim corridor, because Netzarim was where an Israeli settlement was in Gaza prior to their disengagement in 2005. So that was the line that the militarized line that prevented Palestinians from returning north back home to Gaza. Of course, the north is in ruins and is nothing but a rubble as far as I can see. But day 7, they were supposed to allow the native population to return to the north. And Israel decided to hold up the return of an entire million people's population returned to the north on the conditional release of an Israeli captive, who is a soldier, by the way. She was a uniformed soldier who was taken captive, which of course which of course distinguishes from an ununiformed soldier being taken captive and a civilian being taken captive, right? So she is a legitimate prisoner of war in this context. So the return of 1 million Palestinians rested upon the fate of one Israeli settler soldier. Now, she was not supposed to be released until 2, if not 3 more phases later. But of course, because the Palestinians are so intent on allowing their people to return home, because they don't want any more bloodshed or fighting, they of course released her early. But as you can see, the power dynamics at play is that they, with the control of a thumb, can choose whether 1 million people go back to their homes or not. And since then, and excuse me if I'm rambling on so much, but since then, upwards of 500,000 people have returned to the north. People and around 200,000 had stayed, something like 300 initially, but then 200 had stayed through 200,000 stayed through these 15 months. So you can imagine the amount of the bombardments, the invasions, and of course they're the closest to the Israeli settlements in North Gaza, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and the like. So those are the Palestinian parts that border of Gaza that border the north over there. And we'd seen in the past 15 months incursions, operations, they seal off the place, they besiege entire neighborhoods only for them to withdraw, and people sprout back up in their neighborhoods. And so, it's very telling now as this so-called benevolent imperialist policy that Trump and Netanyahu are flaunting about resettling Palestinians for their own sake. They're not really, of course, the devastation and the destruction is taking huge tolls on them, but they're not intent on leaving their homes anytime soon. They want to stay on their land no matter what the cost. I mean, people wouldn't be returning in droves in the hundreds of thousands to go back and return to some semblance of life if they were not attached to their land. And this is what they don't understand. They see it as a real estate deal, Bob, that people can just be bought and sold. And let's return to that after, because I have an interesting quote to share with you from one of the founders of revisionist Zionism about how this is a charade.
Sure. So the other big thing that happened just like last week, I guess, was perhaps without thinking, because Trump often says things without thinking, but he suggested removing everybody from Gaza. And something else that you might want to touch on too is what the people are returning to, what the homes they're returning to look like, right? Because we're seeing these images of like Hiroshima or something like that, right? But and then Trump has basically said, well, maybe we'll just take over Gaza, we'll own it, right? So there's a lot there. But what have they returned to, and what is the general idea about Trump's statement, which has kind of created a great deal of outrage, and even like the other kind of countries abetting genocide have backed off from Trump's idea.
Yeah, I mean, first off, Trump's comments that were made on February 4th did condemn global outrage. It did spark worldwide condemnation. And as you said, even some of the most staunchest Israeli allies like Germany, like France, like the United Kingdom, all came out immediately denouncing this plan, saying that it was unacceptable. Even, and I do commend him, Congressman Al Green, Congressman or Senator? No, Congressman Al
Congress, yeah.
Green. Yeah, Congressman Al Green came out and said that he's going to introduce articles of impeachment. Now, I understand this is symbolic, right? And
Yeah,
it might
yes.
not pass, but it does recognize the magnitude of these statements. Of course, Trump had been toying with this ever since he took office. I don't know how much you've been following, but ever since he's been doing these performative acts of just signing countless executive orders in the White House, in the Oval Office. He had been asked, I think, on day two or day three, whether he thinks a ceasefire deal would hold. And he said, I'm not so sure about it. Situation's a mess. He made a very shocking claim that there are 1.5 million people living in destruction. That suggests that somewhere around 800,000 people had perished. Now, hopefully that number is not as significant. Of course, it'll take us years to know. The death toll keeps climbing because mass graves keep getting uncovered. People have been recovered from rubble. It took about a week for the renowned Palestinian intellectual and poet, Professor Rifat al-Arir, for his body to be exhumed from the rubble, from his body and that of his sister and his nieces and nephews. So imagine it took 1 week of people, groups of people working to take out someone who they know collapsed in this building. Imagine how long it would take to clear devastation that UNESCO said might take upwards of 15 years to clear out. Mind you, that the destruction is there. Yes, Trump is right to say that the destruction is there. But who financed this destruction, Bob? Who paid for it? Who sponsored it? Who gave the diplomatic and political backing from 1948 to allow for such a thing to happen? Who has funded Israel like without impunity for all of these years? It's the United States. Now, Trump likes to frame this in such a way that, oh, Biden, look at what Biden did. I'm coming here with new, fresh solutions to things that nobody has suggested in years. But what he's calling for is outright population transfer, as we like to call it, is textbook ethnic cleansing. I mean, this is textbook
Mm.
19th, 20th century ethnic cleansing policies. And of course, if we
It's like Jackson sending the Cherokee to Oklahoma,
Exactly, exactly. Or it's like trying to impose tariffs on anybody you don't agree with politically, right? I mean, this style of protectionist and isolationist imperial economics doesn't work anymore. And I'm no economist, but I can speak to the fact that these are
Yeah,
failed political economic practices, and the same with population transfers. The act of taking one ethnic group or one religious group of people and removing them en masse is it has always been impermissible, but it cannot be done in the modern day 20th century. This isn't like transferring post-World War One populations between borders. And the fact is, Bob, that the Palestinian people themselves do not want to leave. They haven't left. There's a reason why they haven't left Gaza. I mean, of course, I'm not trying to overemphasize the resilience and say that these people can withstand everything. No, of course not. They're humans like us. They want a roof on their head. They want stable housing, meals, not have to worry about bombs dropping every time. But they're not the reason why these bombs are dropping. They're dropping because there's a settler colonial project that's hell bent on eliminating and exterminating them. And it has found that the uh, militaristic means were no avenue through which they could exterminate the people. They killed upwards of 186,000. The figure might go upwards to 200,000. Of course, the official number that the Gazan Health Ministry, which is depleted, has raised it to 66,000 or 64,000 because they're counting for the 14,000 that are presumed dead just in the rebels alone. And every day since the ceasefire, the numbers have been climbing. But Bob, let me tell you this. If the Palestinian people were open to leaving their land, 500,000 and plus would not return to utter devastation up in the north. I'll be honest with you, Bob, or I have to be honest with you, but Palestinian people, of course, they're attached to their buildings, their material structures, but in the end, they're material. What's more important is the land and the people of the land. You know, when you read reports of Palestinians returning back, of course, it's setting onto them now that they return to apocalyptic zones where everything in sight has just been reduced to ash and rubble. But their main concern are the people they lost, not the buildings. The buildings, we always say in Arabic, نرجع من عمرها in Palestine. We'll rebuild. And that's no problem at all. I mean, Trump's ludicrous comments of building a Riviera in Gaza I mean, the Palestinian people deserve that Riviera for all the death and destruction and suffering and besiegement that you've brought onto them. But they're not willing to leave. Of course, if given an opportunity for a better life, I mean, people would take it, but this leaving means that they exterminate the end of their political rights to the land. Mind you, Bob, this is the longest strip of sovereign Palestinian land, despite it being besieged for 18 years, despite it going through one of the most horrific and largest operations of bombardment in modern warfare history. This is the largest strip of Palestinian land for 25 miles with Palestinian sovereignty on it. No such place like this exists in the West Bank. The West Bank, and of course, we'll turn to this in later discussions, is Bantonized, is cantonized. Every little village is surrounded by settlements and military outposts. And of course, these settlements are the first wing of the military colonization structure itself. And they have cities are gates, have gates on them. There are checkpoints in every section. So Gaza is not just like they can destroy the whole place. I mean, of course, it's apocalyptic and it's heart-wrenching, but at the same time, the Palestinian people are not willing to be resettled to Egypt, to Sinai, to Jordan. These plans have been ongoing since 1948 and even prior to that. And I think it's apt, Bob, to give you this quote by Zeev Jabotinsky, who is the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, of which people like Benjamin Netanyahu are political heirs to. And when Jabotinsky wrote his Iron Wall in 1923, now we're approaching 102 years ago, he had made clear. I mean, you have to give credit to the early days of Israeli Zionist colonial thinkers because they were forthright and outcoming with what they were going to do. They're not trying to hide it. Benjamin Netanyahu, has killed the most Palestinians in history than any other Israeli leader, comes out with a benevolent face and says that we need to finally bring peace and give them stable housing and make sure that they don't live in terror and all of that. But someone like Zev Jabotinsky, who's his ideological heir, is actually very forthcoming about it. If you allow me to read a long quote, he says, "Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon their claim to priority in Palestine in return for cultural and economic advantages. I repudiate this conception of the Palestinian Arabs. Culturally, they're 500 years behind us. They have neither our endurance nor our determination, but they are just as good psychologists as we are." And then it goes on. "We may tell them that we are like that whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable, but they know what we want, as well as we know what they do not want. They feel at least the same instinctive, jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for Mexico and the Sioux for the rolling prairies." So, I mean, a quote like this could not be more apt than it is today. I mean, excuse my language, Bob, but they cannot give a damn about rebuilding Gaza into a Riviera or making it some lucrative business model. This isn't a real estate deal that someone like Trump thinks can just come in and build some prosperous casinos and golf resorts and make everyone happy. These are indigenous people's attachment to the land. And if their attempted extermination did not drive them out, then a farcical deal like this would in no way do so.
You
So,
know,
yeah,
it's
I mean,
years ago when Trump was getting started, he actually wanted to, when he was starting to buy Trump Casino, he actually, I think, was attacking Native American casinos, right? So this goes way back for him, right? He kind of wants to kind of take over and commercialize these areas. And in this particular case, I mean, I think uh, Miriam Adelson and his son-in-law, right? They already have, and they've talked about investments in the region, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's no surprise that Andrew Jackson's his favorite president, right? I mean,
Well, it's William McKinley.
William McKinley,
He's
right? No.
changed.
Yeah, he got from the from the expansionist to the isolationist.
Imperialist. Yeah, no. He's gone from continental power to global power, right?
Global power, right? And of course, there have been suggestions here and there that Trump is willing to impose tariffs on Jordan and Egypt and other countries who might not want to take in Palestinians. But this is at the crux of the Palestinian struggle, Bob. Our question is a question for our right to return to our land. It's not about redeveloping property. Sure, if
Yeah.
they want to develop property, I think they have a moral, political, and even legal obligation to rebuild the land that they've besieged and bombarded endlessly for 18 years. But we do not see that happening. Of course, we know well and straight that this is a project meant to facilitate the colonization of Gaza, and it was actually one of the stated objectives of the Israeli cabinet post October 7th. But of course, they had failed in it. They had also failed in eliminating Hamas as a political movement. It's, I mean, countless wars have made clear that political ideologies cannot be defeated through militaristic means, but yet again, they seem to be hell-bent on dropping billions worth of weaponry and trying to do so. I mean, even outgoing former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, one of his last outgoing addresses, claimed that made the statement that just about as many members as were killed in Hamas ended up joining ranks in their battalions. And by the ceasefire, only three of their 24 battalions had been eliminated. They succeeded, yes, in eliminating the top leadership structure, but it did not at all dissolve the organization, nor did it make it any less militant in its capacity. In fact, it continued to resist and to take up arms up until the very last day. And of course, up until now, it's been living up to its ceasefire. We can see, Bob, I know we discussed this just a couple of minutes ago, but in their exchanges of captives, you see Israeli captives being taken out in clean clothing. They're being given goodie bags. They're taken to their car safely, shake hands with the militants, whereas the Palestinian captives that are returned to their home look disheveled, they anorexic, white-haired, bald, full of skin rashes and diseases, clear signs of torture, young adolescents with busted faces and inflamed lips. So it's very clear. I mean, you can imagine that these people had been taken captive for 15 months, and the amount of restraint and discipline it takes to not take any action on your colonizer while their representative government bombards them relentlessly for 15 months and even takes out more than a third of their own captives in bombing operation.
Well, I was
And
going to say
it,
everybody's aware of the Hannibal Directive. It's not like
yeah,
that was secretive, so
yeah.
they know what was going on, right?
And even further, I mean, you remember in December 2023 when three Israeli captives managed to sneak out from a tunnel and they
And
were they were shouting in Hebrew with a white flag, and the Israeli soldiers took them out right
yeah,
there.
they
I mean,
killed three of their own. Yeah,
they killed three of their own, shouting in Hebrew, waving a white flag. I mean, it's a war crime, like, regardless, Bob, to shoot at anyone waving a white flag. Mind you, a white flag without any clothes, so there's clear there are no
yeah.
weapons and right. So they committed war crimes on their own population. But of course, this is justified on their view under the pretext of being able to colonize and defeat what they claim to be defeating the Palestinian people. But neither of these objectives have been stated. Now, of course, the theater of operations, and we can discuss this in more detail while there's a ceasefire. Phase one of the ceasefire is currently underway inside Gaza. The theater of war has clearly shifted to the West Bank and the Palestinian refugee camps in Jenin and Tulkarem, and to a lesser extent in Nablus, have been under besiegement, have been under aerial bombardment. I mean, 2 days after the ceasefire, the day after the ceasefire took place, Israel bombed with jets the Jenin refugee camp in north of the West Bank and killed 10 people, including a child. They've sniped at children. Of course, this is a continuation of the Palestinian Authorities' siege on the Jenin refugee camp, which only highlights how they operate inside the West Bank as an
Why
arm of.
don't you say a little bit about the PA's role in that? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and In summary, Bob, the PA really did believe that they were going to roll back into Gaza on the tracks of the Israeli tanks once they finished their extermination project in Gaza. Of course, the PA is opposed to the death and the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, but they do see it as a political opportunity to eliminate their opponents in the Palestine National Movement, Hamas. Who, of course, have been controlling Gaza ever since elections what got them into power in 2006, and a failed attempt by the USA, France, Israel, and England to stage a Fatah-led coup against the representative government in Gaza. And that's what, of course, triggered the siege of Gaza to today, because the coup attempt failed to install the PA lackeys into office and remove democratically elected Hamas political figures. Mind you, I don't mean to go too far back, but that was a time when Hamas agreed to lay down its arms, enter politics. They had gone through a stage during the Second Intifada of enacting suicide operations because they wanted to target Israeli society and make them feel the pain that they had been feeling, right? They abandoned that policy. Of course, sociologically, for various reasons, they abandoned that policy and they agreed to lay down their arms. They just wanted to be a political force in power and have a say at the table in Palestinian National Assembly. But okay, long story short, um, as we know, Gaza has been under control of Hamas political party, and the West Bank has been under the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority has worked as an arm and a branch of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. It collects intelligence. It's the first line of defense for protests, for taking out targets. Mind you, when the genocide first started, it was the Palestinian Authority that sealed off Ramallah and would shoot live ammunition at people trying to get to the streets to protest. They've been they routinely undertake sieges and raids in the refugee camps across the West Bank to take out any sections of armed resistance, be them Hamas, be them the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, for Islamic Jihad, for even sections of Fatah that are no longer part of the Palestinian Authority. They have no problem. Like, of course, one of the most prominent Palestinian captives who'd been returned, Zakaria Zubaydi. He's one such figure. He returned in the last deal, like 10 days ago, or the like. He's from the Fatah account wing that's still committed to national liberation. But um, the point is that during the genocide, Mahmoud Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, who's 88, approaching 89 years old, really did think this archaic figure did believe that he was going to roll into Gaza and the international community would allow the PA to rule over Gaza once this is over. So, which is why he continued these collaborations and facilitating Israeli operations inside the West Bank, because of course stage three of the agreement in of the ceasefire in Gaza is about post-war governance, and of course the Palestine Authority are still believe that they might be able to control it. Of course, we don't know what the future holds. Now, this is the price you pay for collaborating with your colonizers, right? You perform all the work for them, only for them to throw you under the bus and say that we're going to take over this strip entirely and build the Riviera of the Middle East over there. So this is their reward for collaborating with colonialism and empire. But 40 days before the ceasefire ended in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority undertook one of its longest sieges in the West Bank on the Jenin refugee camp. They were conducting house-to-house raids, shooting anyone on sight, 24-hour lockdown. These are their own people, Bob, that they're killing. They killed children, they killed a couple of elderly people, they destroyed others' houses at the behest of Israel, only to root out the Palestinian resistance. Pardon me. After 43 days of siege, Palestinian civil society members managed to broker an agreement to lift the siege on Jenin by the Palestinian Authority to take place as the ceasefire in Gaza took over. But then the very next day, Israel continued this siege and has locked down both Tulkarem. Tulkarem is on the western part of the apartheid wall in the West Bank, and Jenin, which is on the northern part of it. But Tulkarem is actually on the separation wall itself, that this iron wall that Zeev Jabotinsky was talking about in the quote I read from 1923. So the Palestine Authority, of course, has been also the first line at repressing any news outlet, news coverage, and inside the West Bank itself. Israel banned Al Jazeera from reporting within Israel proper itself. And then afterwards, in December, the Palestinian Authority closed down, raided the offices of Al Jazeera, and they banned them from doing coverage inside the West Bank itself. They've arrested journalists. So I mean, it's very similar to what the Israeli colonial forces are doing. I mean, they're silencing the truth, regardless of what, be it Al Jazeera or any other news agency. The fact is that Al Jazeera had been on the ground reporting, had been reporting on all of the atrocities that have been taking place across Palestine, and they're reproducing it nonstop, 24-hour coverage. So any attempts at silencing free press and journalism really does allow for cover for colonial atrocities to continue. So they've been operating as sheer lackeys, but this is structurally they have no other option to do so. Their funding structure is through the agreements of the Oslo Accord that stipulates that Israel pays their salaries, that the United States gives them training, that Jordan supplies their weaponry, and that's kind of rotating cycle. So they're enforcers of the occupation. Of course, as we know in colonial structures, at the first line of community defense is to co-opt the native population to suppress their own people. So this is what the situation had been now, and unfortunately, we have a very dire crisis in the West Bank too, because settlement expansions are on the rise. The the ceremonial and menial sanctions that the United States had on a couple of settlers in the West Bank were immediately lifted by Trump. Um, Despite the resilience of the people in the West Bank, the Palestinian people in the West Bank, the fact that they're Bantonized and cantonized across the tiny portions of the strip means that there's no coordinated resistance, there's no networks to access and to mobilize people. So if, God forbid, anything of the scale were to happen inside that happened in Gaza and the West Bank, the people there would be unable to hold their ground, would be unable to fight, and for various reasons, of course, not to say that what happened in Gaza is any less devastating, but the ethnic cleansing project has various forms as we see. It's taken an exterminationist logic in Gaza, and it's taken a settler colonial expansionist logic inside the West Bank, but at any point, this exterminist project might easily convert itself into the West Bank. And this is what we all fear. You know, it's at this point, it also seems like a matter of if, when, not if, right? Because, of course, the first Trump administration was the first to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel. They recognized the Golan Heights, Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. By the way, we're not even talking about the land that Israel took from Syria since December the 8th. And just today, actually, Israel bombarded Syria, parts of the south, under the pretext that they were destroying Hamas weapons depots in South Syria. And now, of course, nobody has commented on the situation since, so we're not sure about the validity of this. But this is the state of affairs that we see today. And
Yeah, let me just put in a plug. About 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Charles Glass, really well-known journalist about Syria. So, you know,
yeah.
if you're
Yeah, I
watching,
must say, I listened to all your podcast episodes, but I've been a little bit behind. I didn't listen
oh,
to.
absolutely. Let's go back to Gaza for a second because they have a part of the ceasefire was that they could return home, right? Well, as I said before, the images look like Hiroshima, right? So what when people head north, go back to where they lived? I mean, what are they doing? Like, is there aid available? Are there people on the ground? Are medical and relief workers being allowed back in? Is there any kind of provision? I mean, obviously, no. What you talked about really does remind me of Vietnam quite a bit, right? The villages were destroyed, people were sent packing, then they went back, the villages were still destroyed. Today, 50 years later, you still have a country which is beset by dioxins in the water and kind of environmental destruction, which we even haven't mentioned. We've actually done shows on the podcast about that in the past. And this is an eco war as well, an ecocide. But anyway, not to get too far afoot. What are they returning to, and what comes next, right? Because it just looks like I said, it looks like an atomic bomb went off in the entire region.
Yeah. So it's a very difficult and it's very heartbreaking for them, of course, Bob. People did return in jubilation and continue to return. All the two main roads inside Gaza, it's Rashid Road and Salah ad-Din Road, which are the two that take you from north to south, were overwhelmed with people just trying to return north, right? Because the situation in the south was equally dire. And since the Rafah crossing had been invaded in May 2024. Of course, you remember back then we were saying the US administration said that Rafah was a red line and they would not allow Israeli entry into Rafah. But they came with their tanks and bulldozers and destroyed the last pockets of entry for aid. And they were trickling it in, trickling it down at 50, 40, 20 trucks, which is nothing, Bob. A neighborhood needs more than 20 trucks. Your neighborhood of Montrose probably needs like 35 trucks
Yeah.
of aid a day if one were to talk about daily caloric intakes and all of that, right? Let alone living normal everyday lives that people do. So the South was completely horrendous. It was horrific living situations because on top of the bombings and on top of the killings and on top of the actual occupation forces inside the south of Gaza and the destructions and the live targeting of so-called humanitarian safe zones, there was no access to aid. There was barely access to any water. The destruction was just as intense in the south as well, mind you. Of course, in the north, it's much more horrific, but it doesn't make the south any more comfortable to live in, so to speak. So disease was rife. There was extreme amount of pollution, overcrowding. Cities that in the past had like the city of Deir al-Balah in the south that before October 7th, somewhere between 130 to 145,000 people suddenly became a city of 1.2 million. And you can only imagine that these are like tents popping up everywhere, 70, 80 people living in an apartment that is probably half knocked down, or if there is a room available, 4 or 5 families would be staying there. So people were eager and desperate to return to the north. But they were also for the most important reason that I alluded to earlier was to find out about their loved one, Bob. 200,000 or so stayed behind. Of course, many of them have been who have had their lives tragically stolen from them, but a lot did survive as well. They survived under the rubble. Even during the genocide, Bob, people were living inside destroyed structures. If there's a tiny bit of opening, of course, these are major safety hazards and concerns. But where on earth are people to go, Bob? They would just, if there was a little crevice that was opened into some part of a demolished building, they would just clean out that area and sleep on the floor. Uh, Now they're returning to that devastation. People are looking for their loved ones. We've seen heartwarming instances of people finding their spouses for the first time in 15 months, fathers being reunited with their kids. A lot of times as tragic and as a father you would know, Bob. I know you only had one son, but if you were to have multiple children you would know this. Families would separate their kids. They would send their son to their brother and take their brother's daughter, so that if my bloodline if I die, my bloodline can continue. If my brother's house falls down, then at least his daughter can continue living on and filling that memory, right? So imagine these kind of hardships that you have to put with, these kind of parting ways with your family, that you'll say like, okay, my sister will go here, my uncle will go there, my grandmother will go in this location, so that they don't kill us all in one place. Because as we know all too well, entire families, something like 980 families have been entirely wiped from the registry. This is ethnic cleansing, Bob. No surviving family member of such. So, of course, people have been coming back, and it's been tear-jerking to see families being reunited. But what are they being reunited to in comparison to what they lost? Because it's unimaginable. And as you said, yes, it does look like Hiroshima, even as the war was ongoing, upwards something like the amount of 6 nuclear bombs of Hiroshima, the equivalent were dropped inside Gaza, which has a smaller square footage of the like. I mean, I'm not sure if you recall, but when the Japanese group won the Nobel Prize in 2024, one of the surviving members for Hiroshima was crying on live TV and said that the images I see in Gaza are what I saw as a kid. And he was crying. He was saying that they were honored to take this award, but that they were expecting it to go to Gaza as well. So it only speaks to this destruction. And something that a lot of people don't talk about, Bob, is how expensive it is to maintain devastation, the sheer level of destruction. How many billions of dollars go into obliterating entire neighborhoods and entire communities and maintaining it as such. Because as you followed through the past 15 months, Israel would enter a neighborhood, they would seal it off. Israel decided to take this arbitrary division of Gaza into around 273, 274 zones. And they would drop leaflets on zone 142 and tell them they have to move to zone 200, for instance, randomly. They would go so-called take care of some operation, claim to destroy a tunnel, uh, argue that they're killing Hamas terrorists, quote unquote, and then people would return to their neighborhood, try and rebuild, and Israel would invade again and destroy it. That's a very, very costly endeavor, Bob. When you see hospitals that are fully bombarded, as Shifa Hospital had been invaded 3 times. Every time they bombard it, they destroy a building. Palestinians come back, makeshift tents, makeshift structures, try and take whatever meager building material they have left and try and build something. And then they come and destroy it. This is an extremely costly. And of course, I really do hope that you bring on somebody who is an expert on ecocide and ecological warfare and devastation. But of course, these impacts are unfathomable to people like you and I who haven't lived through this and seen it. But as we watch on TV, I mean, it takes billions to sustain this, and this is why. Netanyahu and the Israeli government keep coming back to the US, which is why the checkbooks keep flowing, which is why we also say that this is a United States funded led genocide as well, because it is our taxpayer dollars that are funding this, right? They're very
I mean,
well aware that
not long
how
ago,
much
you
it
had an
takes.
article, right, in Jacobin about that, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, I did. And the point that I was trying to make at the time is that look, the we're going through a part of a phase where unprecedented ecological crises are hitting the United States because of irreversible climate change. And the United States made very clear that its priorities lie in warfare and imperial endeavors abroad rather than supporting their own people. Look, I'm new here to Washington, D.C., Bob. Actually, I've been here for 1 month and 2 days now. And I've seen homelessness everywhere in the United States. I'm not trying to say here is any different, but it really does speak volumes when you walk past the White House or when you walk past the State Department and see homeless encampments. Like they're more intent on sending billions and billions abroad to create death, to create destruction, to create mass suffering, to destroy the environment, rather than spend fractions of it to improve their own livelihoods and communities. I mean, of course, I know Washington, D.C. has a huge history of segregation, and I understand the class dynamics at play in Washington, D.C. here. I'm not oblivious to it at all. But when you see homeless people outside the White House, the center of power in the world, it really does speak volumes to where their priorities lie. And as you know, at the time that I wrote that article, Tennessee had experienced unprecedented flooding from a hurricane that hit in the Gulf of Mexico. So, I mean, this is the kind of realities we're facing today. And look at the wildfires that have been happening in Los Angeles and California in the winter. In the winter, I mean, I know you've done shows about this and all, but I mean, just like it's
mhm.
unthinkable.
Well,
They'd
the
rather.
U.S. is.
You are listening to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening to us on your favorite audio platform, please give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you really like what you're hearing, please go to our Patreon, patreon.com/greenredpodcast, and become a patron, or make a one-time donation by going to our website at greenandredpodcast.org and hitting that support button.